Mark Ruffalo noticed a homeless woman sleeping in her car on a cold night, wrapped in blankets with her baby. The woman looked exhausted, and the baby's faint cries echoed through the quiet parking lot. What Mark was about to do would not only change the fate of this family, but perhaps your thoughts as well. Before continuing, if you enjoy stories inspired by real life, please share which platform you watched it on in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. We'll be back tomorrow with another touching story. Mark stepped out of the supermarket with a cloth shopping bag in his hand. The air was cool, the breeze was light, and the trees around him were rustling. He adjusted the collar of his jacket and looked around. Thanks to the sensitivity he had gained over the years, he didn't just see his surroundings, he felt them. Despite the distractions that came with fame, he always tried to stay grounded in reality. That day, he had left the film set early and wanted to pick up a few healthy snacks for the evening. Standing in line, browsing the shelves, greeting people. These were his ways of connecting with life. As Mark walked back to his car, his eyes lingered on a spot. An old model car pulled over to the side. The windows were fogged up and clothes swayed inside in the wind. He furrowed his brow. A sense of unease settled over him. A woman nearby was gathering her shopping carts. Her clothes were worn and her eyes were tired and anxious. It was as if she was trying not to be seen. Mark stopped. A connection formed between them, without a word being spoken. He looked inside the car. The woman kept turning back to the vehicle, as if it were her safe haven. Mark was overcome with suspicion. Was that car her home? The thought knotted in his stomach. The world was full of untold stories, but this story seemed to be speaking directly to him. Mark began to walk toward the woman with unwavering but gentle determination. He didn't want to scare her. He just wanted to understand, maybe even help in some small way. He spoke in a low, careful tone with warmth. The woman was pushing a shopping cart aside, her movement halting. Their eyes met. "Are you okay? Can I help you?" Mark asked, standing at a respectful distance. "No, I'm fine, thank you," the woman said. Her voice was both distant and fragile. Her insecurity was easy to see behind her eyes. She took a step back, holding tightly to the cart. It was clear she wanted the conversation to end. Mark sensed that insisting would scare her. He bowed his head slightly. "I understand," he said. "Just know that I'm nearby if you need anything." Without waiting for a response, she walked away quickly. She opened the door of her car, got in, but her mind was still on the woman. He watched her get into her car. A faint movement behind the window caught his attention. A slightly trembling silhouette. It was a small baby. The woman was holding it in her arms. Mark's throat tightened. His heart ached. He couldn't just drive away from there. There was something about that woman and that child that touched him deeply. As the woman gently adjusted the baby in her arms, Mark turned toward his car, but his mind remained there, behind those foggy windows. He started the engine, his eyes glancing one last time at the car in the corner. The silhouette was still there. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. He knew one thing. He wouldn't ignore what he had just witnessed. The next morning, Mark Ruffalo found himself driving to the same supermarket parking lot again. The women pushing their shopping carts, the exhaustion on their shoulders, and the fog on the windows of that old car. Mark couldn't get it out of his mind. It would have been easy to forget that image, but a voice inside him wouldn't let him. He parked in the same spot. He looked around. The old car was still there, in the corner. The windows were fogged up, and clothes were hanging inside again. A few meters ahead, he saw the woman again. This time she was carrying a plastic bag and heading straight for her car. Mark watched from a distance. The woman placed the bag on the back seat. At that moment, Mark took two things he had brought from home, a bottle of mineral water and a new packaged blanket. He planned every move carefully. It was very important that the woman not be disturbed. He approached calmly and placed the items on the hood of the car. He arranged them so they would be visible. Without saying a word, he returned to his own car and waited. A few minutes later, the woman opened the door. Her eyes locked on the items on the hood. She looked around as if trying to figure out who had left them. Mark continued to watch silently. He let her move at her own pace without breaking her courage. After hesitating, the woman took the blanket and water. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She gathered the items, quickly got into her car, and closed the door. Mark started the engine and drove away. He felt a mix of emotions inside, a bit of peace and a sense of incompleteness. He had taken a step, but it wasn't enough. On the third day, Mark returned to the parking lot. This time, he wanted to talk to her again, but he needed to be more sensitive. Watching from a distance, he saw her gathering her shopping carts again. Her tired face bore the marks of the battle within her. Mark waited for her to return to her car. As she approached, he began walking toward her. Mark's voice was soft, almost a whisper as he approached. The woman stopped, looking surprised and a little uneasy. "Yesterday, I was the one who put the blanket and water on your hood," Mark said gently. "I hope I didn't bother you." The woman turned her tired gaze toward him, but this time there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "Why?" she asked. It was as if this simple question came from a place as defensible as an accusation. "I saw you here yesterday," Mark said, shrugging. "I thought you might need it, that's all." He knew that pushing too hard in such sensitive situations would destroy trust. "If you don't want to talk, I understand," he said. "I respect your boundaries." After a brief silence, the woman replied in a cautious voice, "For the water and blanket, thank you." Her words were slow and deliberate, as if any further clarity would mean leaving herself vulnerable. Mark let her set the pace. He nodded. "I just wanted to help, if you'll let me. If not, that's fine. But sometimes asking for help or accepting it isn't a sign of weakness. Sometimes it's the first step towards starting over." The woman didn't say anything, but Mark noticed a slight softening in her stance. She was still distant, but there was a hint of gratitude in her eyes. He decided not to push it further. As he turned to walk back to his car, he heard the muffled cry of a baby. Mark stopped in his tracks and looked in the direction of the sound. The woman grew anxious, quickly opened the door, and began gently rocking the baby in her arms. Mark waited a moment without speaking, then asked in a soft tone, "Do you need anything for the baby? Milk? A diaper? Anything?" The woman lifted her head. Her tired eyes initially seemed ready to refuse, but Mark sensed a change. She seemed to be losing the battle between her desire to protect her child and her need to survive. "Milk," she said finally. Her voice was very soft. Mark took this small step as a big step forward. He nodded decisively. "Please wait here. I'll be back in a few minutes." Without waiting for a response, he headed toward the supermarket. A few minutes later, he returned with a bag full of supplies. The woman looked more cautious this time, but she accepted what Mark offered her. She held the items as if they were made of glass, bowing her head and murmuring, "Thank you." Mark stood gently beside the woman. "I know it's not my place to interfere, but if you need anything else, I'm here." The woman paused for a moment. Her eyes drifted into the distance before she replied. "It shouldn't have been like this," she said. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but Mark could sense the depth behind those few words. These words were not a complaint, but a cry for help. Mark understood at that moment. This story was much deeper than it appeared on the surface, and this woman's life was at a point where it could be changed with just a few acts of kindness. The next day, he returned to the parking lot. The scene was the same, but there was a difference in the woman's demeanor. She was outside her car, rocking her baby in her arms. Her gaze was distant. There was both exhaustion and resignation in her eyes. Mark knew he had to be careful. "Hello," he said in a soft tone. The woman looked up, but this time her expression was clearer. "You came back," she said. Her voice now held more curiosity than uncertainty. Mark smiled. "I promised. I hope you didn't feel pressured yesterday?" The woman shook her head slowly. "It was kind of you, I understood." Mark sensed that this was the right moment. "Would you like to sit down?" he asked, gesturing to the curb next to the woman's car. The woman hesitated slightly, then nodded. Mark sat down, resting his arms on his knees. There was a brief silence. Then he spoke slowly. "You don't have to tell me, but may I ask your name?" The woman thought for a few seconds, then replied, "Emily." "Nice to meet you, Emily," Mark said sincerely. Then he turned to the baby. "What's his name?" The woman looked at the baby in her arms, who now seemed more at ease. "Oliver," she said. Mark smiled slightly. "Oliver? That's a strong name. It's really beautiful." The compliment seemed to melt the ice inside Emily. Her body relaxed a little, but she hadn't completely let down her guard. Mark knew that rushing things would backfire, so he decided to make a small but sincere gesture. "You know," he said, his voice softening, "I've been through some tough times in my life too." Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I lost people I cared deeply about. Sometimes it was hard to even breathe. But over time, I realized that asking for help isn't something to be ashamed of. Sometimes it's exactly what pulls us out of the darkness." Emily remained silent. Her eyes were fixed on Oliver's face. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was almost a whisper. "Sometimes I feel like I'm completely alone in the world, and that no one really cares." Mark turned his gaze toward her. He responded in a firm yet gentle tone. "I care." He paused for a moment. "I don't know you, yes, but that doesn't matter. If you'll let me, I want to help you." Emily didn't say anything right away, but the expression on her face had changed. It was more open, more vulnerable, but just as honest. That night late, Emily was asleep in the car with Oliver in her arms, and Mark quietly drove back to the parking lot. He had baby formula, basic hygiene products, and a few toys with him. He carefully placed everything at the woman's car door. Then he attached a small note. No strings attached, just my love. The next morning, when Emily woke up, she saw the bags he had left. She was suddenly filled with mixed emotions. When she picked up one of the toys, her eyes welled up. This simple gesture felt less like a luxury and more like a ray of hope. A part of her still wanted to reject everything. She was afraid of losing the only sense of control she had in her life. But another part, a quieter, deeper part, knew that this kindness was exactly what she needed. She looked around. Mark was already gone, but something remained after his departure. Something inside her had begun to change. The next day, when Mark arrived at the parking lot, Emily decided to call out to him. This time, she wouldn't wait silently. Before Mark could get close, she spoke in a gentle but firm voice. "Thank you." She was holding one of the bags Mark had left behind. "This is very valuable." Mark smiled. "I'm glad I could help. If you ever need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." Emily hesitated for a moment. Her eyes dropped. Her voice grew soft. I I don't usually talk about things like this," she said. But she took a deep breath, as if she were breaking down the walls inside her and preparing to speak. "I lost everything. My husband, my home, my life. I still can't believe I'm alive." Mark grew serious. He looked into her eyes. There was no judgment in his gaze, only genuine understanding. He knew she was at a turning point. "Take your time," he said softly. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Emily looked away, but then swallowed for the first time in a long while, and she nodded slightly. For the first time, someone was there just to listen to her. She turned her eyes to Mark. Her gaze was filled with experiences and emotions buried deep inside. Finally, she began to speak slowly. "It all started with Liam's death." Holding Oliver tightly in her arms, her gaze drifted into the distance. It was an ordinary evening. He was coming home from work. It was supposed to be a night where nothing went wrong. Mark leaned forward. His face was calm, listening intently. Emily continued. "When the police knocked on my door, my world fell apart. I don't remember exactly what they said. They just said he died without suffering. But that didn't change anything, because he was gone." Her voice trembled, her lips quivered. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she tried to continue speaking without wiping it away. Mark knew what the silence was saying more than the words, and he was there for her. He was truly there. "After that, everything fell apart," Emily said, her voice growing hoarse. "The life insurance barely covered anything. The bills piled up, the house started to rot, and Liam's family—" She paused for a moment. She clenched her teeth. "They said I couldn't take care of Oliver." Mark's eyebrows furrowed, his forehead creasing slightly. "They tried to take your son away?" he asked softly. Emily shook her head slowly. "Yeah, they filed for custody. They claimed I was emotionally unstable. Maybe I was at the time, but God is my witness. Everything I did was for Oliver. Her voice cracked. I didn't have the money for a good lawyer. When I realized I was going to lose the case, I packed up. I threw everything I could find into the car, took all the money I had left, and fled to another state. Mark listened silently. His eyes were fixed on Emily's face. It was supposed to be temporary. I was going to find a job and get back on my feet. That was the plan. Emily continued with a pained sigh. I found a job at a cafe. Things seemed to be going well for a while. I saved some money, but then a customer started making comments to me. He said disgusting things. One day I couldn't hold back anymore, and I yelled at him. I tried to tell the manager, but he fired me. He didn't care. Mark lowered his head slightly. Emily's voice was trembling. Then the money ran out. We were kicked out of the house. Our car became our home. Her eyes drifted off into the distance. I looked for work, but Oliver was always with me. I had no one to leave him with. No one wanted to hire me. They even judged me for being a mother. You're not responsible enough, and they said. Since that day, it's been like this. I find small jobs. I push a cart. I pray that no one will notice we're living here. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I know. This life isn't right. Oliver deserves better. I know that too, but I'm so tired. The last words knotted in Mark's throat. His chest tightened, and he took a deep breath. He leaned forward slowly, rested his elbows on his knees, and continued listening carefully. He chose his words carefully. Emily, you're fighting a battle no one should have to fight alone, and no one can blame you for that. Emily raised her eyes. There was still a hint of doubt and self-doubt in her gaze. I should have understood sooner, she whispered. Mark shook his head. Number, you're doing the best you can. You fight for Oliver every day, and not everyone would do that. But you do. That's incredible. Emily remained silent. Mark's words echoed inside her. After a moment, she murmured in a voice barely audible, What do I do now? I've reached the end of the road. Mark looked at her directly. His voice was clear, his eyes determined. We'll figure it out together. I promise. Stay here. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Before Emily could respond, Mark stood up and hurried toward his car. He had a plan. He was no longer just determined to help. He was resolved to truly change Emily and Oliver's lives. As Mark drove away, Emily watched him through the rearview mirror. She felt both hope and fear. She wanted to believe, but the past had taught her the price of trusting too easily. As soon as Mark got into his car, he pulled out his phone. He needed to act quickly. This wasn't just about good intentions. It had to be a concrete step. No matter what happened, Emily needed to have a roof over her head tonight. Exactly 40 minutes later, Mark returned to the supermarket. Emily was still there, sitting in her car with Oliver in her arms. She looked up at the sound of the engine. There was still a hint of suspicion in her eyes, but this time, curiosity won out. Mark got out of his car. He was holding a small envelope. He stood at a respectful distance, made eye contact, and spoke slowly. I've arranged a room for you and Oliver. It's a small motel. It's clean, safe, and ideal for tonight. We'll decide what to do tomorrow. Emily slowly got out of the car. She held Oliver tightly against her chest. Her gaze went from the envelope to Mark's face, then back to the envelope. She was conflicted. There was a battle raging in her mind. I can't accept this, she said finally. I don't want charity. Mark replied in a calm but firm voice. This isn't charity. This is humanity, and we all need help sometimes. Please, this could be a step forward for you, but for me, it's something that needs to be done. Emily hesitated. Her exhaustion felt like an invisible weight on her shoulders. Finally, she reached out and took the envelope. Inside was a room key, a note with the motel's address, and a few bills. She swallowed. There was a mix of relief and shame in her eyes. She managed to say, Thank you, her voice barely a whisper. Mark smiled. You're welcome. I'll make sure you get there safely. The motel room was small, but to Emily, it felt like a palace. A large, clean bed, fresh sheets, a small bathroom, but it was theirs alone. The yellow lamp by the bed cast a soft glow. Peace had settled into the room. Emily laid Oliver on the bed and took her first deep breath in a long time. She carefully laid Oliver on the bed and gently covered him. After the narrow car seats, the constant hum of the engine, the cold nights. Now for the first time, he was sleeping peacefully in silence on a soft bed. Emily sat down on the edge of the bed. She looked at her son for a long time. Her eyes filled with tears and she couldn't hold them back. Tears began to flow silently. For the first time in a long time, she truly felt safe. And perhaps for the first time, she felt hope. She took out the small note that had come with the key. It was a simple sentence written in Mark's handwriting. "You're not alone. We'll get through this together." She read it word for word. And those few words were exactly what she had needed for days, maybe even months. At that moment, Mark had parked his car after dropping Emily off at the motel. He didn't start the engine. His eyes were fixed on the city lights ahead. The sky was clear with a few stars visible, but there was more on his mind. How had Emily's life come to this point? When had she been left alone? And what could he do now to make up for this injustice? Mark took a deep breath. He knew just one night's rest wouldn't be enough. A warm bed, a bag of food. These were good but temporary. Emily and Oliver needed a real fresh start, an honorable, lasting, hopeful beginning. He picked up his phone. He opened his contact list. He started typing messages, taking notes, making calls. "I'm going to make this work," he murmured to himself. "No one deserves to go through this fight alone." In the motel room, Emily checked on Oliver again. Her breaths were slow, deep, and peaceful. Then she slowly lay down on the bed. Exhaustion washed over her body in waves. But this time, it wasn't like defeat. It was like a transition. Before drifting off to sleep, she whispered to herself, "Maybe this is a beginning." Outside, Mark finished his last phone call. He looked toward the motel entrance, its light glowing in the distance. A faint but determined smile played on his face. Now everything was beginning, and he knew that this small step would open the door to a whole new life for Emily and Oliver. The next morning, Mark woke up early to put his plan into action. He had spent the night sending messages to trusted friends, reaching out to old connections, and thinking about long-term solutions for Emily and Oliver. This wasn't charity for him. It was an opportunity, a chance at life that someone deserved to be given. His first stop was a community center he had previously donated to in New Well. The director greeted him warmly. Mark got straight to the point. He told Emily's story. He mentioned the need for temporary shelter, social support, and, if possible, a job. "Emily is a fighter," Mark said, "but being outside the system, no matter how strong you are, wears you down slowly." The director nodded. "We can provide a few weeks of lodging," he said. "We also have social workers who can offer guidance. And yes, we have a few ideas about job opportunities." Mark thanked him sincerely. Before leaving, he made a donation to the center, not just for Emily, but for the many others like her who were struggling. That afternoon, Mark returned to his motel room. Emily was holding Oliver in her arms, sitting quietly by the bed, lost in thought. The door knocked softly. Emily opened it carefully and saw Mark standing there with a few bags in his hands. She smiled. "I brought you a few things," he said, handing her the bags. Inside were new clothes for Emily and Oliver, hygiene products, and a few basic necessities. Emily didn't look at the bags. She looked at Mark's face. There was a clear emotion building in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You've already done so much." Mark shook his head. "You don't need to thank me, really, but if you're ready, would you like to talk about the next step?" Emily shook her head slowly, and opening the door a little wider, she invited him inside. Oliver was playing with the small toys Mark had left a few days earlier. Emily sat down across from Mark and began listening carefully to what he had to say. "I've arranged a safe place for you to stay for a few weeks," Mark said. "During that time, we'll get in touch with social services. We can also talk about some job opportunities. Everything will be step by step, at your pace." "I've also talked to some people I know about job opportunities," Mark said in a soft but firm tone. There might be some options. Of course, we'll go as far as you want to go. Everything will be at your pace. Emily blinked. She found it hard to believe that someone, especially someone so well known, would go to such lengths for her and Oliver. Why, are you doing this for us? She asked in a trembling voice. Mark paused briefly to think. Then he answered sincerely, because everyone deserves a fresh start, and if I'm in a position to help, it would be wrong of me not to. Mark accompanied Emily to the community center. The director greeted them at the door with a warm and sincere hello. The place wasn't fancy, but it was clean. There were rooms prepared for families in need, a small communal kitchen, and a simple yet warm atmosphere. Emily was shown a room. Inside, there was a single bed and a small crib for Oliver. As Emily looked around, Mark noticed tears welling up in her eyes. I can't tell you how much this means to me, Emily said, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Mark smiled. You don't have to pay anything right now. Just focus on yourself and Oliver. And remember, this isn't help. It's a new beginning. That night, as Emily tucked Oliver into his crib, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As the crib rocked gently, Emily listened to his peaceful breathing. And for the first time, the thought of the future didn't scare her. Outside, Mark was talking to the community center director. I want Emily to have all the support she needs, he said. If she needs more time or other resources, please call me. The director nodded, smiling slightly. Don't worry, you've given her something no one else ever has. A chance. Mark paused for a moment as he walked away from the building. He looked up at the still-lit building and murmured to himself, there's a starting point now, but there's still a lot to do. Weeks passed. Thanks to the community center's support and Mark's connections, Emily found a new routine. She landed a part-time job as a receptionist in a small office. It wasn't just a source of income. It was the first step toward rebuilding her self-confidence. It was Emily's first day at work. Mark walked her to the office door. This is just the beginning, he said with an encouraging smile, and you'll do a great job. Emily took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped inside. At first, her hands were shaking, but thanks to her warm-hearted co-workers and understanding manager, she began to relax quickly. As the days went by, she received small compliments. Her kind behavior, her punctuality, her quiet yet dedicated work. And every evening when she returned home tired, she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was in control of her own life. One evening, she told Mark about her day. She said she had decided to meet Oliver with her mother-in-law and father-in-law on her own terms. Mark listened quietly, then nodded. That's a tough decision, but it's also brave. Giving them a chance shows that you're in control of your life now. Emily looked at Oliver playing on the carpet in their small apartment and smiled. She knew she wasn't alone anymore. Before her lay a future she had shaped with her own hands. One day, while sitting in a cafe, she turned to Mark with a cup of coffee in her hand. With a grateful yet determined smile, one day I'll pay you back for everything you've done. I want you to know that. Mark nodded slightly and replied softly, Emily, you're already paying me back. Every step you've taken, every effort you've made for Oliver. I didn't do it expecting anything in return. A brief silence fell. Emily continued without looking away. Still, one day I want to help others the way you've helped me. A proud smile appeared on Mark's face. That's it. That's the true reward for kindness. If you use your story to inspire others, everything will be even more meaningful. That night as Mark walked home, he looked up at the sky. The stars were shining silently. He knew that this story had changed not only Emily's life, but his own as well. What they had achieved together filled him with an indescribable sense of gratitude. Emily, meanwhile, tucked Oliver into bed at home. She watched him fall asleep peacefully. She knew the future wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for the first time. She was walking with courage, hope, and belief in herself. This story doesn't end here, because every new day can be a new beginning. And remember, even in the darkest moments, light often comes from the most unexpected places. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Click on the screen for more real stories filled with hope, compassion, and resilience. Because we all need a beginning.